Welcome everyone to the intersection of media, politics, and democracy. This program is a joint venture between OLLI at George Mason and AARP of Virginia. For more information on this, I'm going to start with Amber Soltani, who is our AARP Virginia representative.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Meg. I'm Amber Nightingale Soltani with AARP here in Northern Virginia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning on behalf of AARP Virginia. We're really thrilled to be collaborating with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University to bring a sampling of their rich programs to our members. And this is our second semester partnering with them, and I hope that many of you will take advantage of the rich programs that they offer on the regular basis and check them out. From our earliest beginnings, AARP has been a champion of lifelong learning. From our founder, Dr. Ethel Percy Andrews, once said, quote, "The eagerness to learn, to pioneer in the development of new skills and new abilities, to broaden the personal scopes of understanding, to freshen the mind with new ideas and new concepts, to achieve new heights of knowledge has no age restriction." And that is true today as it was when she spoke those words in the 1950s. Studies have shown that challenging your brain in new ways throughout your life may strengthen your brain. Our brain is stimulated and makes new connections when we learn new things or pursue new interests. So AARP encourages you to stay curious and give yourself a good mental workout by doing something that challenges your thinking, offers you enjoyment, and encourages you to grapple with new and complex ideas. So again, I want to welcome you. And with this, I'll turn it over to Jennifer DeSana, the Executive Director of OLLI Mason.
Thank you so much, Amber, and welcome everyone. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University has been in existence for 30 years, and we serve curious individuals who participate in lectures, clubs, trips, and special events, as well as volunteer opportunities such as teaching and service on committees. There are many things you can learn and do at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. And I want to welcome all of our OLLI Mason members, as well as those of you who are in Virginia and across the United States online through our AARP connection. You can learn more about OLLI at olli.gmu.edu. And Meg will put that in the chat for us. We are very happy to be collaborating to bring our wonderful speaker today, Kathleen Burns. She has been an OLLI lecturer and contributor to the OLLI program since 2009. And among the courses she has presented are Diplomacy at Risk and Using Drones to Cover the News. She is a past president of the DC chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists and a mediator in Virginia courts. Please welcome Kathleen Burns.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be with you all. I give great commendation to Meg Probylski, who's done the technical aspect. I am not a high-tech guru, and so she has made this whole program possible. I wanted to give you a little introduction for the talk. When the 13 US colonies decided they would form a new united government, they did not want to imitate Britain's monarchical policy of prior restraint. Under that concept, the king alone decides what will be published. It is a form of censorship. To prevent that, the new country gave the citizens protections for free speech, including the Declaration of Independence, the US Bill of Rights, and the First Amendment to protect the free press and free speech. But from 1786 on, these two issues have challenged politicians and the public alike. This lecture explores the expanding contemporary context of free speech beyond newspapers, magazines, radio, and TV in the realm of social media, websites, and digital platforms. The courts and Congress have also jumped into the fray, along with politicians, lobbyists, white supremacists, QAnon supporters, and media purveyors of deliberate misinformation and disinformation. This is not a new problem. But the massive megaphone of blogs, bytes, and a lack of verification of some data and it creates confusion, distortion, mayhem, and as we saw firsthand on January 6, 2021, riots, destruction, deaths, and injury. Today's lecture is to put the concept of media, politics, and democracy into some kind of context, and to show them not as contradictory forces, but as dynamic, changing influences. Next slide. And to put this in historical framework, US colonies did not want to imitate Britain's monarchical policy of prior restraint. It is a form of review of content and printed materials to prevent their publication. It occurs when the king would decide whatever would run. And we've seen this in some autocratic countries, in places now like in Austria, some aspects of Austria, some Latin American countries. It's not a positive thing. I lived and worked in Australia for several years and was surprised in a progressive country like that there is no First Amendment. We are very unique. That I lived there for 5 years and worked as a member of the press and also taught at a university. But I only wrote one article for an Australian publication because truth was not a defense in Australia. And I thought, ooh, this is gonna be a good thing. So next slide. There are exceptions to some prior restraint doctrines. US courts view prior restraint as unconstitutional until proven otherwise. For a government or organization looking to review and restrict speech, it offers a compelling reason for this restriction to be that the courts have recognized some of these reasons are exceptions. One is obscenity. The US courts have decided that the distribution of certain obscene material can be limited in order to preserve public decency. But there's a lot of debate and dispute on what is obscene. One former Supreme Court justice said, I know it when I see it. That's pretty individualized. Obscenity applies to pornographic materials that features unwilling or underage participants. Next slide. Some major cases involving prior restraint. And these are only 4 of the cases that we picked out. Give you the dates here. Back in 1931 was the Neer versus Minnesota case. It was published, the first issue with the Saturday Press, an independent controversial paper. The governor of Minnesota at the time filed a complaint under the state's public nuisance law for an injunction against the paper. He alleged that the Saturday Press was, quote, malicious, scandalous, and defamatory, quote, qualities which were illegal under the current law. In a 5-4 decision delivered by Justice Charles Hughes, the court found the statute unconstitutional. The government cannot restrict publication prior to a release date, even if the material that's being published might be illegal. The second one is the New York Times Company versus United States, and probably one of the more famous ones. This goes back to 1971. The Nixon administration had attempted to block the publication of a group of documents known as the Pentagon Papers. This is interesting because this is the 50th anniversary of this case. Papers were part of a study commissioned by the Department of Defense to document US military involvement in Vietnam. The Nixon administration argued that if the New York Times published information from the study, it would harm US defense interests. But 6 Supreme Court justices sided with the New York Times, denying the government's request for an injunction. The court adopted a, quote, heavy presumption, quote, against prior restraint under the First Amendment. The government's interest in this case was keeping the paper secret so they could not provide a strong enough reason to restrict the freedom of the press. In a concurring opinion, Justice William Brennan added that the government did not offer evidence that the papers would result in direct and immediate harm to U.S. troops. The third case is Nebraska Press versus Stewart. And this one occurred in 1975. In this one, a Nebraska judge, state trial judge, issued a gag order. Gag order means you're blocking publication of something for a certain period of time. He was concerned the media coverage of a murder trial might prevent the court from seating an unbiased jury. The Supreme Court heard the case a year later. In a unanimous decision delivered by Chief Justice Warren Burg, the court struck down the gag order. The court argued that restricting media coverage did little to help ensure a fair trial and allowed rumors to overcome factual reporting. The press should not be hindered except in situations where there, quote, is a clear and present danger, a very famous quote, that the media will disrupt the trial. Justice Berger wrote, the court listed ways that a fair trial could be ensured without the use of a gag order. The next case is the Brandenburg versus Ohio. And this included 1964. A Ku Klux Klan leader in Ohio delivered a speech at a rally using derogative and racist language. He was arrested under Ohio's syndication law for publicly advocating for violence. Justice Clarence Brandenburg was convicted and sentenced, and his appeals were affirmed or dismissed by lower courts. The Supreme Court reversed his conviction on the basis that, quote, clear and present danger, quote, and, quote, bad tendency could be ignored prior to inciting this violence. In the Brandenburg versus Ohio case, the court unanimously backed the, quote, imminent and lawless action test. In order to restrict speech for inciting violence, the government must provide a compelling argument to show intent, imminence, and likelihood to incite. I'm originally from Chicago, and I remember there was a very famous case involving the courts with prior restraint that a group of Nazi supporters were going to march through a Chicago suburb that had high Jewish residency, and that the court ruled that this was an incident of free speech. And though there was lots of complaints about that, free speech has very specific barriers, and the people marched, and people that became out of hand were arrested. Next slide. Next slide after that, that's my sources. Okay, legal protections for speech in the USA. And Virginia is a predominant place with the colonies for creating precedents for free speech. Next slide. The Constitution of the United States includes the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibition, the exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. We talk a lot about the First Amendment, but we don't seem to, many people have no idea what that involves. Probably they're aware of the Second Amendment than the First. The First Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1791 as part of the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Next slide. Here are the specific citations for Virginia's involvement. That, quote, the freedom of the press is but one of the great bulwarks of liberty, and it can never be restrained but by despotic governments, found in Section 12 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776. The Virginia Declaration of Rights was influenced both by the U.S. Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the U.S. Bill of Rights in 1789, which includes the First Amendment. Next slide. Thomas Jefferson, who was a monumental figure in American history, as well as in Virginia history, was a champion of the free press. And he maintained that he would support the free press even with things that he didn't agree with. And this has become something very contemporary, that do we support this? Do we not support this? There's a lot of nasty speech, but it doesn't mean that we have a right to bar it. And Jefferson, both as a politician and as a member of the Virginia Society, was a very strong supporter of free speech. Next slide. Another great supporter of free speech was a crusader known as Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist, a newspaper owner, and a tireless advocate against racism and justice. She investigated lynchings and published her findings as pamphlets and in newspaper columns. She was a very courageous person and almost lost her life on several occasions. After reporting on a particular case in 1892, locals in Memphis burned down her printing press and ran her out of town. But her popularity has come full cycle. They've just named a street in her honor in Chicago, where she also was very involved as a journalist. Next slide. This is when we talk about ongoing threats to free speech and free press in the United States. Out of 180 countries on the 2019 World Free Press Index, the United States ranks 48th. That's a pretty sobering statistic, falling 3 spots from the previous year. Increasingly hostile verbal attacks on the press from public officials and others, bomb threats and suspicious packages sent to newsrooms, and the government's repeated attempts to deny the press access to events of public interest are some of the reasons for this decline, according to Reporters Without Borders. I'm active in the Society of Professional Journalists, and I have been greatly alarmed that many of the newspapers in various parts of the country now have to send reporters out with a security detail because of people threatening the lives of people attempting to get the news to the public. Next slide. The First Amendment, we'll go into detail in just a minute, but it's vastly expanded since once it was originally created with only newspapers and printed materials as a basis. The earlier concept of prior restraint has been broadened to include constitutional protections for, quote, speech, media products, text, and film, which is judged before its publishing, censoring the effect it may have without knowing it, sometimes only based on a creator's reputation or past work. For example, if we say somebody had published things that were considered perhaps pornographic, if they're trying to block something in the future that they're writing. Recent examples of some of this expanded definition where people are trying to invoke prior restraint would be in the Trump administration attempting to evoke prior restraint for the publication of a book by Mary Trump, the niece of President Trump, and former National Security Advisor John Bolton, whose book was blocked several years. I think that has now been removed, but it had a long court battle. However, the government can exercise prior restraint only in those cases related directly to national security. And that point is widely debated by lawyers and judges. To give a little background on Citizens United, this has probably been the most consequential decision regarding First Amendment and free speech. Was in 2010, there was a 5-4 decision that the Supreme Court held that corporate funding of independent political broadcast in candidate elections cannot be limited because doing so would violate the First Amendment. What it meant is they removed any financial constraints on how much money could be given to political contexts and overturned the McCain-Feingold law, which had set up some limits. They also blocked access for people knowing who contributed some of this money, which I think was a terrible mistake. Next slide. We'll go back. I thought. Can you draw? Is there more on that slide? Maybe not. Okay. Citizens
No,
United.
there's nothing else on that slide.
No, okay, sorry. Okay, Citizens United removed any trace of transparency in the record keeping of who was giving the money. It also waived any individual limits on giving, nor was the Federal Election Commission required to publicly disclose the name of any individual contributors, including corporations. So the major proponent of this is corporations have free speech rights. I wonder if this is something that will be seriously debated in the past. I mean, it's been in effect now for over 10 years and has radically altered the course of elections and politics. Next slide. Okay, Federal Election Commission, talking about the Citizens United, was a landmark decision concerning campaign finance. The ruling effectively freed labor unions and corporations to spend money on electioneering communications and to directly advocate for the election or defeat of candidates. The result of the Citizens United and SpeechNow.org decision was the rise of a new type of political action committee created in 2010, populated dubbed the Super PAC. In an open meeting on July 22nd, 2010, the Federal Election Commission approved 2 advisory opinions to modify FEC policy according with legal decisions. Political committees that make only independent expenditures, such as super PACs and the non-contribution accounts of hybrid PACs, may now solicit and accept unlimited contributions. That is a very important point. Unlimited contributions from individuals, corporations, labor organizations, political committees, and individuals. However, foreign nationals are prohibited from making contributions, donations, or expenditures in connection with any election, federal, state, or local. Any foreign nationals may not donate to any party, committee, building fund, or fund electioneering communications. There are many cases going on in the courts right now of people who contributed in the 2020 election, 2018 election, who were foreign nationals and did not disclose this information. This is a criminal offense. During the current 2-year election cycle for the contribution of individuals to federal candidates for president, the US Senate and the US House of Representatives has increased to 2,800 per election. Now, when we say for individual, you could be listed as several different things. You could be Mr. and Mrs., you could be an individual, you could be part of a family contributing block. This is a fairly significant amount of money compared to what it was in past years. This new change in the laws gave corporations and unions the green light to spend unlimited amounts of money on ads and other political tools calling for the election or defeat of individual candidates. We've all noticed how painful the election season has become with the things that have been shown on television. It's now, in the nutshell, the court's 5-4 decision said it's okay for corporations and unions to spend as much money as they want to convince people to vote for or against a candidate. I lived in Australia for almost 5 years, and what I was surprised at is how much tightly controlled their election process is. It's mandatory for everyone to vote in Australia, so you don't spend any money getting them to the polls. Everybody in prison can vote, so there's no felon restoration. The election group comes to the hospital, so anybody that's sick can vote. They come to all the airports. You can vote coming in or going out of the country by showing your ID card. With mandatory voting, it's against the law not to vote, with a $75 fine or jail time. But one of the wonderful things at the top of the ballot is it says, they list the people to vote, and then you can say none of the above. And you check that off, so you filled your obligation to vote, but you didn't have to say, yes, I want to vote for this person or that person. We could do this in the United States, so people would not stay home. We just had an election in Alexandria this summer, and I think we only had 13% that voted. So I think in some ways, Australia is way ahead of us. They also have regulations on advertising for any political campaigns or processes. And there must be verification that what you say is true. Wouldn't that be a refreshing change of pace? Next slide. Next one. This is the total cost of US elections. And you can see from 2016 to 2020, the cost of it doubled to an estimated 5.1 B as in boy billion with the presidential races and 5.6 for the congressional races. This is a lot of money. This is after-tax income. Because the FEC changed the rules, we don't have the same kind of transparency or investigation. Some of this money maybe could have been spent for better things. We don't necessarily know that much more about our candidates, even though we're bombarded with some of these ads. And there's no standard for ads in terms of what must be true or must not be true. Next one. Next slide. The 2020 election, was estimated to cost $14 billion. Now, we won't know exactly how much this costs till they go back and look at the records. It's only been about 6 months out. The Center for Responsive Politics previously estimated that we'd see nearly 11 billion in total spending, and they vastly superseded that. The races for the White House and the Senate pushed the total spending past 11 billion, with weeks yet to go before the election. Even in a pandemic, everyone is giving more in 2020. I think people were bombarded by things they got in the mail, by billboards, out on the road, by things they heard on the radio. And social media has become a massive force, whether you want it or not. At one point, we had more access to news information that was verified. In some cases now, that's not the case, that we have some channels that are more opinion than they are factual data. The next one. Next slide. Okay. Presidential contest is expected to see 6.6 billion in total spending alone. That's up from 2.4 billion in the 2016 race, so almost a threefold increase. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden was the first candidate in history to raise 1 billion from donors, and that's not the final tabulation. President Trump raised 596 million, which would be a strong fundraising effort if it wasn't for Biden's immense haul. Next slide. When Citizens United was decided 10 years ago, conservatives were the quickest jump on the newly possible outside groups as a way to facilitate huge donations. Now, liberal groups have more than made up the difference and are taking advantage of every opportunity to get their message out. These are all legal channels, and there's no limit on amount, and there's very little transparency. Next slide. This confrontational debate on media, politics, and democracy will be tearing at the fabric of society for a long, long time. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, here are some powerful examples. Okay, the first one. This is from December 12th, 2020, of protesters on the Capitol for the mega march. In retrospect, this was probably a rehearsal for what was to come next. We see the Park District has stopped giving estimates of how many people show up for rallies because it's very hard to estimate that. But this brought thousands of people out, and that the police forces were not well prepared because it was like 9/11, where there was not the right kind of communication between all these law enforcement officials and what was happening and what was going on. So I think it was amazing on December 12th, lot more people were not killed and injured. That came next. Next slide. We see the divergence of opinions, the signs. They were encouraging people. This was, after the election. The election had been November 3rd, and people thought November 7th, when it was finally declared that Biden had won by 8 million votes, this was over. My sense is this won't be over for a long, long time. The amount of photos that were taken on December 12th, January 6th are monumental to try and categorize some of these, what people saw and what people heard and the perceptions. I think something that some politicians are not being realistic. We all watch these things happening on television. This isn't something that was made up by Hollywood. And when we get to January 6th, we see some of the more negative consequences. Next slide. And here we had 140 policemen, law enforcement people that were hurt. We had 5 that died. We had a lot of destruction to property. You can see they had set up the things for the upcoming inauguration on January 20th. All those things were ripped out. It was very sobering yesterday to hear the 4 policemen testify on Capitol Hill about their own personal experiences. And as a journalist, it's a shame that we're waiting 6 months later to hear what these people had to say and the traumatizing effect it's had on their lives. Some of those people have not been able to return to duty yet because of PTSD and other physical injuries and things like that. I'm surprised that hundreds of people weren't killed because the potential for being stampeded to death was there. And there did not seem to be a heads-up coordination. And this has been a source of many of the debates and discussions and public hearings. I'd encourage you, if you didn't have a chance to hear some of that testimony yesterday, to look it up on C-SPAN, because these people are not public relations experts. These people are telling, this is what happened to me, and I'd like you to know what happened to me and how it's affecting me doing my future job. There was, I think his name was Officer Dunn, saying how hard it was to return to work on January 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, when all the signs, the fences went up. National Guard just left after 6 months, and some members of Congress are opposing paying the bills that the National Guard had to spend to protect the country. And I'm like, what is happening here? We see data. This is not made up fairy tales. So next photo. What I think is scary is how many people came fully armed, knowing full well that weapons are not allowed inside the Capitol Hill building. They came wearing all kinds of military armaments and that kind of thing. We have not had an insurrection like this since 1812. This is something that will affect all our politics, all our major gatherings going on. How do we protect people in the face of such anger, upheaval, rioting? Like we said, this is not new, but some of the attacks on this have been very surprising. When one of the congressmen was talking about that these were just rowdy tourists. No, these were not rowdy tourists. Next slide. Something that probably could use a lecture by itself, and I'm not qualified to give it, is the whole QAnon conspiracy that came into the forefront on January 6th. This was not new. Part of this had become more well discussed when there was the Pizzagate, where Some fellow drove in from out of town that he was convinced, who was a QAnon supporter, that politicians were using this pizza parlor as a front for child pornography and capturing people, and that it grew and grew. It is surprising. The two members of Congress are outspoken supporters of this QAnon theory. Lauren Boebert, who's a Republican from Colorado, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a Republican from Georgia, are quite outspoken in the defense of the QAnon conspiracy, and also very antagonistic in some of their approaches to free speech, free press. That when the policemen were testifying yesterday, some of these people were doing a counter protest, members of Congress, questioning these policemen. We are lucky we had so many policemen that were willing to put their lives on the line to protect these congressmen. And it's like, do you not have a TV set? Did you not watch this? So next slide. With the buildings, the destruction of some of these buildings, and the repairs that have been going on, and said, we'll have to figure out some way, how do we pay for all this? How do we decide what really happened? I would hope that there is neutral interest in following these hearings so that we know what happened. Sergeant Dunn, when he testified yesterday, said when somebody hires a hitman goes to jail. But usually we also investigate the person that paid for the hitman, who provided some of these very well orchestrated networks, who coordinated this activity. People didn't just say, let's show up on January 6th. I think of concern. I heard yesterday some of the statements that the next time they're looking for a rally of this magnitude is August 13th. And all of those of us who live here should be very concerned. If we don't pay the National Guard, who came the first time, won't be coming back. If we don't work better on communicating between the FBI, the CIA, some of the local channels, so that we know to expect and prepare for this, so there isn't people getting hurt and destruction, we won't be ready. Next slide. The question remains, why is free speech important in the United States and in the global context? This is something that all of us have a role in free speech in terms of what we say, what we don't say, what we say to our children, our relatives, in our conversation. I can tell in neighborhood gatherings that people are, besides with the pandemic, very, very cautious about saying anything about anything, because they don't want to be perceived as social malcontents. And I think there has to be a better ground for, well, what do you think? And not be afraid you get hurt if you say something. I'd like to end on the quote from the Index on Censorship. Quote, freedom of expression is a fundamental human right. It reinforces all other human rights, allowing society to develop and progress. The ability to express our opinion and speak freely is essential to bring about change in society. That right is not determined by where you live, how old you are, how much money you make, where you went to school, what country you came from. If this is a basic human right, and if we deny free speech to other people, we should not be surprised when something like that can happen to us. When we look back at history, it's amazing how World War II didn't just begin on December 7th, 1941. It had been going on for years in various pockets in Germany, and then all of a sudden it was out in the public domain. We need to all be part of free speech and support it, even speech we don't support or approve of. That it's something where we can't have a democracy without a concept of free speech. So I'd be happy to take some questions. And Megan, I think, will be the one who sends the questions, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
First of all, we're going back to visit Citizens United. There are questions. Were Hobby Lobby and the Koch brothers instrumental in that decision?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. And what was interesting is Hobby Lobby has become a monumental political organization, not just something that's a business concept, in terms of how they've restricted free speech for some of their own employees. And they took it a step further, that not only they're against free speech, they got into healthcare by attempting to ban any of their employees using their health insurance to purchase certain things that would be under normal health insurance. So Hobby Lobby has become a very highly politicized organization. I'm not familiar with the amount of money that was spent, but it was quite extensive.
And we're going to go even further back in your talk for a little bit. Didn't Jefferson have some pet journalists who published some nasty stuff in his support?
He did. He did. When we talk about at the end of life and we all get together in the great beyond, I would like to sit next to Jefferson one night and say, there are a lot of things about you that I wonder about. Perhaps we could talk about them now, because he was very much for free speech, not so much for women with free speech. And some of the other things, it was a very, very nasty time. The election of 1801 is probably one of the ugliest we've ever had in American history. And because I was trying not to have 5,000 slides, Jefferson was a man of many diverse opinions. And if the social and cultural revolution that we live in now was existing then maybe he would have been able to have more of an open relationship with the woman that birthed his several children, but that wasn't possible then. So here somebody is talking about freedom and free speech, had slaves. There are contradictions in many of the members of the colonial legislative assemblies and some of the things. I think it's difficult sometimes when we go back in history and try and judge people from 300 years ago by modern standards. And standards depend on where you grew up, where your family emphasized certain things and other things. And the pervasive opinion now, somebody's good or bad person, depending on if I like you or if you agree with me. And I find that one of the reasons it's interesting to teach with OLLI, with adult audiences, it's much harder in some cases to teach with millennials because they don't have a lot of unifying experiences. They don't, like at George Mason, many of them do not live in dormitories. They don't have, like top 10 sports teams that just everybody coalesces behind your team. We did away with the military, which at one point was a very unifying experience, that you were all in this together. That I think free speech is one of the things that we're struggling to figure out. What does this mean now and who gets to benefit by it? Because social media is probably one of the most powerful forms of opinion building on a global scale. And we don't have the same confidence that something we read on the internet is necessarily true. Next.
Our next question kind of ties into your last answer. Does the First Amendment apply to social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, Parler, YouTube, etc., as well as email communications from individuals and groups? If not, in your opinion, should it?
This is being widely debated with Facebook is a private profit-making company, and so is Google. I think there have been some attempts to remove a lot of the disinformation and falsehood from some of the things on Facebook. And I don't know how successful they'll be with that. When you have a lot of money generating all this revenue, it's very hard to pull it back. That it's probably something, if people had any idea this was going to be so successful, maybe they could have laid out some conditions. I'm afraid of Facebook and social media. I had only been on Facebook for 6 weeks. I have this huge family with 26 nieces and nephews, and we thought, well, let's all get on Facebook, and then we can hear what everybody's doing. And 6 weeks later, I was hacked in an ugly way. They burned out the hard drive, they encrypted my files, they made threats on the phone, and then they got into my bank. And I thought, I do not need Facebook. And even after the police weren't taking many reports because it's so widespread with people being hacked, who do we want to make some of these decisions? And in one time, the Congress, their job description said, we make laws and we debate things. And nowadays, somebody in Congress described the Senate as a fifth-rate high school team that hasn't won in years and still fighting for the championship. And I think, Congress has lost the plot in terms of making rules for the public good. And I don't know how that will straighten itself out. Do we need 2 parties? Do we need 10 parties? Do we need everybody to run as independent so that we can have some idea that we're all on the same page? I think when I look at somebody with the power of both Google and with both Facebook for good and for bad, without any controls, and I don't know who should apply those controls, who should enforce those controls. Should there be some basic standards of, we did away with the equal time protection that used to be on broadcast media, that if you had one group that talked, then the other group had to get equal time. We did away with that. And I think we've all seen things, we're sitting there watching and we think, wait, that's not true because I was there or I saw this. And I don't know, for so many people, social media is their only source of information on what's happening in the world. And they're making judgments and spending money and forming relationships based on some of these things that are not true. But who do we want to decide what is true? I'm only a journalist. I cover the news. I don't necessarily interpret it. And I think sometimes things that should be opinion pieces and labeled as opinion pieces are not always that way. But I don't think people differentiate as much in their news sources as they once did. I was surprised. I picked up Time magazine a couple of weeks ago. I'm not a regular Time magazine reader. My husband is. And I was astonished to see how very, very long all the stories were. One of the great things about Time magazine is you could whip through it in about half an hour, and they had interesting little baubles of pieces. I find the Washington Post is so long. I would like to see shorter stories, more concise, more well edited, but there's so much detail and people are not following newspapers like they once did. That it's a very confusing world. And I think with young people, so few of them follow any kind of print news whatsoever. I think something that has been surprisingly popular is news on your phone. You can look up New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and some of these others at very reasonable prices compared to what you have to pay for the paper version. Part of this is when they're marketing news, they have to try and figure out, how do you want to spend your money? And do you only want to get news that has one point of view? I think this is disturbing. I don't want somebody to make up my mind. Give me the data, give me the facts, give me the science, and I can sort it out. But there are only so many hours in the day, and people are very busy. So I think we should all be very concerned what the enormous power that Amazon has, the enormous power that Facebook has, that it would not be a far-flung idea that at some point department stores will cease to exist because everybody buys everything at Amazon. And I understand that we all want to save money, but it's like, yeah, how are we going to do this? So, next question. Meg, any others?
Yes. As a journalist, what do you see as the reason journalists give equivalence to opinions on both sides of the insurrection? Why do they continue to have Stop the Steal supporters on their news programs without holding them accountable?
And I think that depends on your channel. I think it depends that I saw somebody was talking about how Fox was covering the testimony by the policeman and saying, why hadn't some of this been covered before? I think Fox has a very specific audience versus something like PBS. And I think this idea we want to cover both sides equally can lead you astray. I worked on the Hill as a congressional investigator at one time, and I was reviewing grants that the National Endowment for the Arts and for History were giving grants. And one of them was saying that this one proposal only talked about the negative aspects of Nazism, and they should have talked about some positive ones. And I thought, how is this possible? What is possible? What is positive about Nazism? And it's like slavery. And they say, well, there were some positive things that everybody had a place to live and were fed. And I'm like, that is a really weird interpretation. I think also as a journalist myself, that we call people journalists who have no journalistic training, who don't subscribe to the cited professional journalist has a code of ethics that we all adhere to, like doctors and lawyers have ethics. Sometimes I think we go astray trying to cover both sides of something that doesn't have two sides. And I think people are so entrenched with their point of view of what happened on January 6th. I don't know how they'll ever resolve some of this thinking. We certainly don't want this to happen again. We don't want it to happen soon, like on August 13th. And I think people need to be discriminating in the media that they select to see what kind of information they're providing them. I wish I had endless hours and I'd read the Atlantic Monthly because it gives good insights. The New York Magazine gives good insights, but how many hours a day do we want to spend just reading? And that's a finite resource. Next.
Okay, you've got a couple of comments on Boebert and Green about, of course, they have the right to the freedom of speech as everyone else does, but don't they need to be held accountable for what they say? And to follow on to that, there's an opinion that Boebert and Green were complicit in the coup by giving tours of the building a few days before and were in communication with the people and therefore are complicit in their attitude.
And I think that's something that may come out in some of these hearings. I guess there were several members of Congress who provided information. I saw there was something on the news this morning of one congressman actually went and opened the doors to let these people in. I think to maintain a democracy, some people have to be accountable. And where does it stop being free speech and being totally untrue? And who makes those decisions? And the courts have done that. This select committee will be a public forum that I heard some criticisms yesterday. Why didn't we do this at nighttime where more people could have watched it? And I thought that's a financial decision, that all the evening shows have sponsors. And we don't, because we're all in a pandemic, because we're home, doesn't mean we're all watching television 24 hours a day. That I think this is something that the jury is out on this one to see who's going to be held accountable. And I think all four of those policemen made such compelling cases for what they witnessed, saying that they'd all been police people for a long, long time and never been the subject, to people actually wanting to hurt you, to beat you, to drag you down the stairs, to hit you, and to try and steal your gun. And I hope this will be a public forum, that some of this will be covered in evenings where people can watch it, that I think most things you can watch at C-SPAN. But I know we have so many parents who have young children and they're trying to divide up teaching from home, working from home, especially with younger children. Children are very labor intensive, and you can't always watch some program that you'd love to see or hear. I would like to see more people turn to radio. I've said to my students, I would require them to listen to the news by radio because it eliminates some of your biases. If I look at somebody on television that, and I think, oh, I don't know if I like the way he or she looks, I don't have that same obstacle when I'm looking at a radio. And I think we've forgotten in some things how to be neutral about a lot of things. I grew up in a very large family, and my mother would say, when somebody asks you what you think, they don't always want to know. So sometimes she said, you're better to say, even if it's not true, that you hadn't made up your mind. And I thought, well, I think I'm surprised as an American citizen, the freedom that people feel to be cruel and mean and hurtful on a regular basis, and then put that on television and say things that aren't true. We grew up in households, most of us, I'm sure, where it was a great value to tell the truth. And the problem, I guess, is when your truth affects somebody else's truth. And that's why we need to have some consensus on what happened on January 6th and who should be held responsible for it. I don't see us getting the National Guard to round up these people. 500 have already been indicted. And I think that's probably a very small number. Who knows? This is something that will go on long after we're all dead, in the sense of figuring out what happened and how do we prevent this happening again. I think we're very lucky that hundreds more weren't hurt or killed.
Okay. We have a question. Would you give your thoughts on the use of citizen pressure and denunciation to silence speakers, including the use of student pressure to ban certain speakers at universities?
Okay, I've taught at 7 universities, and I think when they have a policy that some people can't come to campus, part of that is a monetary issue for security, because we don't want to have a riot, we don't want to have an uprising. Certainly in universities, a major issue is birth control and abortion that don't affect the older part of the population. And I think on some of these things, rather than having a solo speaker, they might be better off to have organized debates. Debate is something that the word has been prostituted. Debate used to go back to the Greeks and the Romans, the British, who do a great job at debating, and they had regular forums. Screaming and yelling at people is not a debate. And I think I always felt as an instructor in universities that if you came to our school and went home unchanged with your opinions, then we failed. Not that we browbeat you to open your mind and be open to other opinions. There's some people, they mentioned earlier, I'm a mediator in the courts under the George Mason umbrella. And I have been astonished to realize that there's some people, I could not convince them that today was Wednesday. That some people just have never been trained or experienced negotiation, in the sense that other people have different opinions and might not agree with you. And when I look back on growing up with 9 people, we had 1 car, we had 1 phone, and we had 1 TV. So in retrospect, everything was negotiated, who was going to watch these programs, who was going to do this. My mother even My brother found a pay phone booth, so when you made calls, you had to pay for your phone calls. I worry about, some of these channels that we had in school, like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, where you taught people how to go along to get along, disappear. I worry about it in university housing because the trend now is to have one person to a room so that you don't know how to compromise, and that compromise isn't a bad thing. When I look back on going to college with people that were very diverse, I mean, till I went to college, I thought the whole world had dinner at 6 o'clock because we did. And I think you cannot have a successful life if you can't compromise. I would say one of the most difficult schools I've taught at was George Mason. And part of that is because only about 10% live in the dormitory, where you're forced every day to sort of negotiate the terms with your roommate. And I required them, these were journalism courses I was teaching, to have a group project. And I finally could see I could not force them to do this. And I said to them, okay, you win, but you lose at the same time. You'll never be able to go to work because you don't pick the employer picks you. And if you can't negotiate, that will be difficult. You won't be able to date because dating is negotiation. Should we go to this movie? Should we go to this movie? I said, don't even think of getting married because it's a lot of negotiation. And certainly having children is 24/7 negotiation. But some young people just don't have that skill. We have a lot of people that have only one child in the family, and you don't have to negotiate in the same way. And I worry with college that all colleges are not teaching people to look at pros and cons and to analyze data, even in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. One of the things I thought was very good that George Mason did was conflict resolution program that they started among grammar school kids. And the 4th graders would mediate the 1st graders, and the 8th graders would mediate the 5th and 6th. So we all have conflicts, and we just don't usually recommend you go for your gun to solve those things. This is a skill that we should be teaching more in our schools, more in our homes. I worry about some of these things that people just throw up their hands and say it's hopeless. No, it's like we don't have term limits in a lot of our elections because the term limits our elections. And so when I see in Alexandria 13% voted when we have a lot of issues, I'm thinking, this is really too bad. I wish I could think of a legal way to incentivize elections. If we could give door prizes, that would help, but it's against the law. So there must be some way. We're doing it with the vaccine. We're giving you certificates, we're giving you tuition, we're doing other things. It's hard sell in America. I don't know with 330 million people, how it's possible to reach an agreement on anything because it's such a huge group. I think I was very lucky when I was in Australia that I was 10,000 miles away and I'd see this filter of things going back on home and how I would think about it. I felt very safe because they outlawed guns at some point. I also had a great experience. I taught at Howard and I knew what it felt like for the first time to be part of the minority. Most people don't always have that kind of experience. And I was there when they had a riot and I was very afraid. And my students circled around me and said, nothing will happen to you, Professor. And I thought, oh, I hope you're right. And they were. And it just changed all these little fairy tale ideas I had in my mind. One of these kids came up to me and said something that was so funny, not at the time. He said, it's really hard. He said, I can't tell Irish people apart. He said, do you have that problem with Black people? And I said, I haven't thought about it like that. Probably. But my sense is we give up too easy sometimes when a little more talking, not screaming, talking would be helpful. But I have a sister with 12 kids, and I said she should be head of the United Nations because she already knows how to negotiate things. And all the kids have grown up and turned into decent people, so good for her. Megan?
Okay, we're going to go back and visit Citizens United again. You've had several questions on how could the Citizens United be overturned? Could it be done through legislative? Does it require a amendment to the Constitution? And is part of the reason they won't address it the fact, or that Congress used to be able to keep their unspent campaign funds when they retired?
Right. Yes, they could. You don't normally overturn Supreme Court rulings, but we did when Plessy versus Ferguson were separate but equal was the rule we had for the schools. They could change this by congressional action, saying they basically overturned John McCain Feingold bill, where we had public statements of how much money was being spent, who it went to, and that they accounted for all this. So Congress could, part of the problem is because all the money goes to Congress. And people don't ever turn back money. That I think with elections are so fraught. You know, we really haven't, and November 3rd was our election. November 7th, we declared the results. There are many people that still don't believe that has happened. And it's like, it's impossible for people to move on when that's hanging out there like an albatross. And it's because there's so much money involved in our elections. It was stunning to see how differently they did this in Australia and in New Zealand to some extent, that we buy our candidates, and we know we buy our candidates. And disclosure is interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see how this campaign plays out with Terry McAuliffe and the Republican opponent, who's already contributed $75 million of his own money to this campaign. And it's perfectly legal. Virginia has some of the weakest election laws in the United States, that there's no maximum amount that you can give. And it's totally legal what they're all doing. So I think with Citizens United, it's probably one of our most transformative court decisions in the last 200 years, apart from separate but equal in terms of education. It was the most unfortunate case, but I think the other thing as a journalist, we're still fighting about cameras in the courtroom. And, you know, what would be the problem there? Very few of us ever get to go to the Supreme Court to watch a case. And yet these cases have great impact on all our lives. What is still the problem? I can see in lower level courts where there's a jury, and body language and all these things are so important. But I think this is something, especially with the pandemic, all these cases have now been decided by Zoom. And so why couldn't we have cameras in the courtroom? So who knows? Stay tuned. Megan?
Yeah, I'm trying to conglomerate a couple questions here. It talks about how news was laid out in fact and opinion, and the naming of the different sections. It used to be news, now it's like front page and Metro, and they used to have different names. How is that affecting freedom of speech in that, you know, you're not, oh boy, I'm not doing a good job conglomerating here. But how, between journalistic ethics and how fact and opinion have become almost the same thing, or appear to be the same thing?
It depends on the publication or the station or the outlet that you're looking at. Some have their own point of view, and things are only used to subscribe to that point of view. I think so much of the New York Times and the Washington Post, the stories are too long. And yet the New York Times is considered the national paper of record. I think what I'm noticing more are headlines, and some of the headlines don't necessarily relate to the story. I find one of the more interesting things for sections is the sports page, and how some of their headlines are very funny, very clever, right on target. I thought when they did when Katie Ledecky lost the swimming race to the Australian, and then they had a full page picture, and the headline said Aussie rules. Anybody that spent time in Aussie rules knows that refers to the different rules they have for their football is our soccer. But it was such a compelling thing, and the sections they're putting out on the Olympics have been very interesting, that people need to be discriminatory in some of the publications they read. On the other hand, you need to read things you don't always agree with. But I do think in some cases, people don't know that what they're reading is opinions. Now, the Post and the New York Times are usually pretty good with that, labeling op-ed and those kind of things. I think it's so unfortunate we're seeing such a plummeting number of political cartoons. Political cartoons are where the action is at, in the sense, very few words and sometimes no words, you get a tremendous punch. And when the recent Washington Post cartoonist retired, they decided rather than pick one, they would turn from this wide field, and some are better than others. If you look at a cartoon and then you think, what is this about? The cartoon has failed. I'd like to see more political cartoons. I think Doonesbury was the pioneer in political cartoons, but I think Doonesbury has sort of lost the plot. But some of these others are very funny and right on the money, but very individual. I am not the authority on free speech. The free speech has a cost, and sometimes we aren't sure how to allocate that cost and who pays for it. Next.
Okay. Free speech and social media are important, but do you feel that there are times they are causing damage by spreading false things and bullying? And do you think there will be more restrictions to the rights of free speech besides you can't yell fire in a crowded theater?
I think the problem is social media is normally a private company. Facebook or something else is a private company. And it's different because the newspaper is a public entity. We can hold you to a different standard. I think this is one of the great controversies with free speech. When we came up with that doctrine back in the 1700s, there was only print media. And now there really aren't a lot of rules for social media. You don't have to tell the truth. It bothers me when they call out Facebook that these things are not true and they keep running them until they figure out how, they want to look at this as a utility. We have rules for the television and the radio, but we don't really have rules. It's like the Wild West when you look at social media. There's so much money and so much power in these small little entities. And the same thing with Amazon. Amazon is a tremendously powerful force in terms of what it chooses to publish or convey with its books and some of its materials. We see the downside has been on small bookstores because you just can't financially compete with a giant like Amazon. And I find myself guilty of that sometimes, thinking, all right, how much do I really want to pay for this? Does not help the small business person. So. How are we on time, Meg?
We've got 10 minutes. We're doing pretty well.
Okay.
Okay. I'm trying to.
Let me also give my email, and if somebody has a question later, send me an email and I'll try and get back to you in the future. It's Burns Kathy, BURNS KATHY, no period, 1036 @gmail.com.
Okay, we have several questions on verifying facts in stories, including social media and other places, and that free speech is seen by free speech absolutists. They don't go with it, the responsibility that you have to be saying you have to be saying true things. How do you see that playing out? Is there a way to make it work?
I think everybody's television set has many channels. And if there's something you don't like what you see, you turn off the TV or you turn off the channel. Nobody forces you to watch any of these programs. I think some people who watch Fox watch only Fox, which probably limits their perception of what's happening. Fox also makes the most money, I think, of all the networks at this point. So it's free speech versus money, free speech versus power, free speech versus perception, and free choice. That I'm not here to speak for or against Fox News. That people wouldn't turn it on if they didn't agree with that point of view. And nobody can make you watch anything unless you're taking a course for credit or something to watch a certain program. I find also, like I said, with listening to the radio, but it depends on the channels. There's versions of Fox on the radio that people, unfortunately, when they turn to media, it's only to enhance their point of view. I wish we had a more dynamic public broadcasting system here like they have in Australia, which is fully funded, or in England. In England, anybody who buys a television set, a certain percentage of every television set goes to the BBC, and that they do have diverse opinions. I think a lot of people don't want diverse opinions. And I think that's a difficult thing. I was at our civic association meeting on Saturday, was Zooming, and I was very surprised at the end. Some new person who belongs to our civic association made a very derogatory comment about a worker from one of the Alexandria agencies who had just given a report. And he just personally attacked this person in the sense of saying, I didn't agree with these points and I just wanted to be on the record. And it was so out of hand. Fortunately, it was the end of the meeting. But I thought, what empowers people to do that with a group where they feel they want the attention to be on them instead of on this report? This woman was a city employee who gave up an hour on a Saturday to speak with no compensation. She had some wonderful slides, good points of view. You don't have to agree with anything she said, but you don't go after her for doing what she was asked to do. And I'm like, oh, I'd like to see a revival of Miss Manners used to be in the Washington Post, and she'd talk about how to behave. And sometimes I think, wow, our mothers and fathers set a certain standard, and this is how you behaved in private and in public. And I think some of that's been diminished and it's not been helpful. But that's how people look at life, and that's how they look at the First Amendment. The First Amendment is very vulnerable, depending on how and by whom it's interpreted.
Okay. A third of Americans get all of their news from social media. How can we get more real news in the hands of more Americans?
I wish I knew. I think, cost is a factor. I started looking at the New York Times on my phone because it was so much cheaper. I think it was like $4 a month, where it was costing me almost $10 just to get it on Sunday. I think this is something that has to go back to grade schools when we talk about where do you get your information and why it's important to have different sources. I think a lot of young people, including a person that lives in my house, would not imagine people reading newspapers on a daily basis, but I grew up in a household. My mother read 4 newspapers every day, which was amazing. But I think it's interesting when you get with groups and you'll say something, oh, did you hear about this or hear about that? And they look at you like you have 10 heads, and they were things that are normal, routine news, because radio news is very short. Print news now is getting longer and longer. I think if we could figure out a better way to get people to look at more diverse news sources on a regular basis, social media is just overwhelming. And I've seen things where I thought, wait, that's not true. I know that's not true. I don't know how we, this in a free society, democracy, we can't make you do anything. And that's getting to be hard. We can't make you take the shots, even if it'll save your life. And I can't wrap my mind around that. Why you would voluntarily do that. I'm glad to see some of the governments are stepping up, and in order to work at the VA, you're going to have to get the shots. Good. I don't understand why they don't have that for the military. When you're in the military, you sort of belong to the military, and you have to be ready to go for all kinds of unexpected things. If we can't even get you to save your own life, what can we do? And I've spent my life in journalism and public media, and I think it's scary. We also have a major problem in America with literacy. We have so many people that cannot read for comprehension. We have so many people that can't read English. And I think that's a problem when they're driving cars or going to the store and they can't read labels. And that's not a problem. Many people focus on literacy. So there are more than enough problems that we can look at, but I hope the purpose of this talk was just to think about some of these things you may not have been thinking about before, and that we're all part of the First Amendment dialogue. That this is not an absolute, and that we worry about some of the sources drying up and others not being fully neutral. Megan?
Okay. I think that this is a question, not me thinking. I think that our school curriculum should integrate critical thinking skills to help citizens evaluate all the information so they could vote with understanding of issues. Also, civics would be valuable in helping students understand the conflicting forces in our society. Democracy requires voters who can make informed decisions. What do you think? And as a tag onto that one, we have another lady who said they had to read the same news article in various newspapers in high school and had to notice the differences, and what a great tool that was.
Yeah, well, when I grew up in Chicago, there were 4 daily newspapers. And I remember starting out, my first job was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. And the press pool, we'd all cover these same press conferences, and I would read what the other 3 wrote. And I'd think, this is odd because I was there. I think also with civics, it's mandatory in most high schools to teach it, but it's taught in mixed ways. Here in Alexandria, my daughter took advanced placement civics, but there was no time in the curriculum to ever go down to look at the Capitol or any of the Capitol buildings. I think sometimes we teach things with only date and place and spelling of a person's name. There's still, we would laugh with my daughter, and she'd come home and I'd say, okay, how many people are in the Congress today? And she'd think about it and she'd say, oh, 250. I'd say, no, every single day it's 435. And in the Senate it'd be 100. And that was something that never sort of resonated, and that why we have this form of government versus parliamentary system. When I went to Australia, I was shocked at how different the parliamentary system was, and I could see what worked and what didn't work. And one of the things that doesn't work is you can only be elected to be head of the country if you come from the House of Representatives. So they shuffle the deck, but you've got the same cards. And so they're very limited in the pool to bring in new ideas and new people. I think I was surprised how little I knew about civics in many cases till I went to work as a reporter, and they sent me to the courts for the first time. And I thought, wow, we should have come to the courts in 3rd and 4th grade. And instead of saying, this is where you come if you get in trouble and then you go to jail. How different things work with civics and with democracy. People don't talk about democracy. I think till January 6th, this was something we never could have imagined happening in our lifetime. And because it's happening and will continue to happen, we need to talk about it in our own little pods and our families, our social groups, and see, what really did happen so that we could make sure that this doesn't happen again, because it was not a peaceful protest. I'm all for peaceful protests, but this was not. So democracy is a good thing. I have no great ideas how to make it better. I think one of the things growing up every night at dinner, we would talk about a current event. Now that seems almost quaint when you look back, because so many people don't have the luxury of everybody sitting down and having dinner together because of sports and clubs and activities. And my youngest brother would say sometimes, he was only in a high chair, and he'd say some of the stories same time, same day, and we'd say, Mom, this is horrible. And she'd say, he's little, this is how he learns. And we're like, well, could he speed it up? It was like, no. So I think we need more humor too in life. That's some things that we should laugh at instead of being prepared to be offended, or everybody doesn't look at life the way we do. I can see my daughter once said to me, and I'll never wear your clothes. And I said, well, that's good. And I won't wear yours either. So life is hard in America right now because the pandemic has ground us down. Jobs are hard to come by. Economics are up for grabs, and people think, how is this going to play out? And there's no end in sight. And I think, how do we march on, united as well as individuals? How do we think out loud and not be afraid of people being offended or hurting us because of what we said? And those are all really good concerns. So I thank you all for coming. Send me an email if we didn't get to your question.
Kathy, I have put your email in the chat so people can go to the chat and copy it from there.
Good.
And if we could go on for hours, because there's still so many more questions that you're probably going to get bombarded.
Okay. Well, let me add, I am recovering from knee replacement surgery, so I am at a slower speed than I used to be in the past, but I will try and get to all your questions over a period of time.
Okay, thank you very much.